Welcome to the Conscious Combat Club, trauma-informed martial arts by women, for women. I'm your host Georgia, and I cannot wait to go on this journey with you. Please note that some listeners might find this content distressing. Take care, connect with your support networks, and refer to the organisations in the show notes below. Welcome to our new segment, Fight Science. Fight Science is a new episode format in which we will bring to you conversations with the authors of peer-reviewed papers about martial arts and combat sports. In these episodes, you'll get to hear from the author what the practical takeaways are from the article, and you'll get way more from the conversations than you ever could from skimming an article, and I think even from reading the paper itself, although we've dropped that into the show notes so you can check it out if you would like. This is a part of our commitment to bridging the gap between research and practice. Our first guest is Dr. Alex Channon. Alex is the course leader at Brighton University for the Bachelor of Sport Management and the Bachelor of Sport Studies. And Alex's research is super broad across many themes related to martial arts and combat sports. He has explored things like gender, sexuality, violence, themes around media, concussions, and so much more. In today's episode, we are going to be breaking down a paper he wrote about consent. The paper is titled Communicating Consent in Sport, a typological model of athletes' consent practices within combat sports. Alrighty, so Alex, can you please explain this paper to a 14-year-old?
Okay, so this paper is, it's about the idea of consent. So again, if you're 14 years old, you've probably had some lessons at school about consent, probably in the context of sexual relationships. Mm-hmm. You've probably been taught about consent mostly in that context. Maybe if you've had any medical procedures, you might have signed a consent form for that. You might have signed a consent form to be, take part in a research project, maybe. Whenever we do things with each other that kind of cross the boundaries of what would normally be acceptable, we have to, or we in a legal sense as well as kind of an ethical sense, in terms of being good to each other, we have to be sure that the other person's okay with doing what we want to do. So for instance, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, man, you're going to need some surgery, right? Your shoulder's a mess and we need to cut you open with a scalpel and fix it. They're not just going to do that to you. They have to make sure that you understand what's going to happen and that you say, it's okay for you to do this surgery on me. And I give you my consent to do that to me. So very, very important sort of principle in terms of living in a society where everyone has respect for each other and everyone has the same rights and so on. We need to know that people consent to doing things with and to each other. Now, it's very interesting in the context of sport, because we do things in sport like we tackle each other, we throw each other on the ground, and we kick each other in the head for fun, right? We choke each other out, and we do all these things that, man, if you did that in the street, you'd be going to prison, right? So in sports, we need to have an understanding of the fact that people consent to this. And it's because of consent that people don't go to prison for rugby tackles. Right, that's the legal principle. If you were going to try and prosecute somebody, that's why they wouldn't get prosecuted, because you've consented. So in this paper, what we're doing, we're writing about martial arts as a case study, but we're really writing about all sports, really, all contact sports, let's say, in the sense that we don't really know very much as researchers about how people give consent in sport. So we do have quite a lot of research on sex, as you could probably imagine. It's a very important topic. We have quite a lot of research on medicine. Again, it's, the legal ramifications of being a practicing doctor, nurse, whatever. You have to know how people give consent for this. And in other fields as well, we have this good understanding. But in sport, where consent is really, really, really important, actually, we haven't got a lot of research. So we don't know, how do people give consent to do sports? And how do people know that they've given consent to do the things that they do in sports. So in this paper, we basically try and spell out how that happens in martial arts and combat sports. There are 4 main different ways that we've identified. There are ways for people to communicate consent. And in the paper, we talk also about some of the ways that those methods kind of break down sometimes.
Nice.
So
what are the 4 ways?
Okay, so the 4 ways. So first of all, there's what we've called explicit consent, where we're literally saying, are you okay to do this? Yes, I'm okay to do this. We're directly communicating with each other. So if you think about signing a form before a competition that outlines, this is what's going to happen. You sign here for our records to show that you've done this. Some of your listeners who compete might very well have done that recently if they've signed a form. You might also see it at the start of a competition. The referee might say, are you ready?
Are you ready? Yeah.
Are you ready? Let's go. So that's that question. A coach might ask someone, you sure you're okay? You're injured. You're okay to carry on? Like this. So you have these kind of conversations, perhaps with your training partner. I get injured all the time, so I'm always talking to my partner. Are you all right? Are you injured? Do we need to take it easy and so on? So that explicit, direct communication. I'll go through all of them and then I'll come back to some of the problems with them. So the second one will be like kind of implicit communication. So we're not saying it out loud in a way that everyone can understand. But if we're going to roll in jiu-jitsu, you train jiu-jitsu, don't you, Georgia?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if we're going to roll, we would, first of all, we would put our hands up and we would slap our hands and then we would bump. And then we know that means it's okay to start sparring now. You wouldn't just grab each other suddenly on the mats. I mean, you might do if you're friends. And I'll come back to that one. But generally in jiu-jitsu, that says I'm ready to go. And then when I'm ready to stop, I will tap you or I'll say stop. In karate, we bow. In boxing, we touch gloves. So we have these kind of rituals, these conventionally recognized gestures that people outside of martial arts might not understand. But in martial arts, we do, and that's how we communicate our consent to get going.
Yep.
We also in that category, we also put another thing, which is sometimes we get this ability to sort of read each other. So you and I are sparring, let's say, and we normally spar together, and every week, and I kind of know what you like. I know your energy levels, your pace, and I can see that today you're a bit slower than usual, and you don't quite seem yourself. And I'm going to kind of read that and I'm going to adjust and I'm going to take things down a notch because maybe something's wrong. She didn't want to say it outright. I'm not going to pry, but I'm going to take it down a notch. So we've got this kind of unspoken communication. Equally, it might be that I'm sparring with someone and they land a really good shot. They catch me and they give me a little grin. And I think, oh, okay, so we're going to go, are we? And I'll turn it up a little bit and we'll match our... So it's like intensity negotiation. Some other writers called this. We argue that that's a form of consent practice because there's these little nods, these little smiles, these little things that say, okay, we're still on the same page. Again, that can break down, and I'll come back to how. So that's the second category. So both of those are communicative, and we're starting to get more towards the sort of reading of somebody rather than directly communicating with them. The third category that we call assumed consent. And this is, by and large, the main thing. Whenever I talk to anyone in sport about this is the thing that comes up. How do you know that someone's consented to being rugby tackled? Well, they're on the pitch, so they must consent to it. Okay? How do you know that someone's consented to being punched? Well, they're in the boxing ring. They wouldn't have stepped in the ring if they didn't consent to being punched. So you don't have to have any kind of formal or informal communication. A lot of tournaments, people don't sign consent forms. And they don't touch gloves before the fight. They might not do that as a way of whipping the crowd up a little bit, No communication of consent, but they're in that space and that's sufficient. And legally as well, that's often the case. It's accepted that you understand what happens here. You're in the space, you've consented. So because we've got these kind of formal structures of sport, there is a space that you do it in, the ring. There is a time between the ringing of the bell. There are rules. There's a referee to oversee it. Because of all of that institutional structure, we don't really have to explicitly affirm our consent to each other. to do things, because we can read that into the behavior of other people. So that's the assumed consent. And then finally, the fourth category we call deferred consent. And this is a really tricky one, because we're no longer effectively making our own decisions about what happens to us when we're deferring consent to other people. So it might be the case in a training context where the coach says, when I say start, you start, and when I say stop, you stop, and you don't stop before that. And when people are sparring, the coach might say, go harder with him, ease up on her, whatever it is. The coach is giving those instructions. In the context of a competitive fight, it might be the case that somebody doesn't want to, particularly in boxing, they don't want to take a knee, they don't want to quit on the stool, they've got too much pride. The coach will throw the towel in for them, and that's a long-standing practice in boxing. So the coach withdraws consent on behalf of the athlete. Or an example that really stuck with me from one of the projects that I did, an MMA fighter friend of mine who explained to me why he gave up his back and got choked out, was that he didn't want to tap to strikes. He was mounted and the guy was punching, landing lots of strikes. He knew he was done, but he wasn't going to tap to strikes. Then the referee hadn't stepped in, so he gave up his back and let the guy get the choke and said, I'll just wait for the referee to stop the fight, basically. So he didn't want to submit because of the pride implications. So he gave up the referee to do it for him. So people are deferring their consent. So normally, if we're training together, and like I said, in that example where perhaps your energy levels are a bit low, I'm going to say, I'm going to make sure I'm matching that. So we would adopt this kind of position of looking after each other. When we defer consent to somebody else, we're kind of absolving ourselves of that responsibility. I'm not looking after my opponent because the referee is supposed to. So we've deferred that to that person. So there's 4 different types of consent there: explicit, implicit, assumed, and deferred.
Okay, I have a story that I think almost like pulls all of these different types of consent and highlights, I think, some of the problems. I'm pretty sure this happened after I read this paper, or sometime around it, because I remember thinking about consent a lot when this happened to me. So I was training in an MMA fight team training class, and it was at a time where COVID was happening, so there was a lot of time in and out of training, and some people were able to really continue training through that and some people weren't. And it was a class that I was not aware was going to be a sparring class, but because of the increased number of girls there than usual, the coach said, okay, well, we're going to have the girls do sparring, which kind of makes sense, that girls want to get experience sparring with girls, right? So the sparring then started. They just said, all the girls are going to get in the ring. And I think that piece around you just do what the coach tells you to do, especially if you've done martial arts for a long time, gets really ingrained into you. So for me, starting when I was 12, you just say us in karate. It's not very much is this a conversation around do I or don't I want to, do I consent? It's just whatever the coach says is disrespectful to not. And so you very much just sort of say yes. And there was an incident where at this time, one of the female MMA fighters was told by the coach off to the side, I want you to go really hard. But the coach didn't ask anybody else, are you okay if she's going really hard to match that intensity? And when the first punches started coming, they were hard. And so I said, whoa, that's too hard. So a verbal tap, verbally, I suppose, trying to negotiate consent. To which she said, well, no, I have to, because the coach is outside, watching me, they're making me. And the strike came again, to which then I turned around and said to the coach, this is not okay. You can't assume that I'm consenting. To which the coach just said, you're not. She didn't even hit you that hard. And let's say I'm no longer with that gym. But it was really interesting to me how, of course, yes, I touched gloves with her. Yes, I was in the cage. So you might think that I'm consenting, but how hard did I consent to being hit? Did I consent to being hit with high intensity? I obviously know what high intensity is like because I've had full contact fights before. So it was very interesting to see how like that, it's not so black and white. It's not just, do you agree to be punched in the face? It's, well, how hard do you agree to be punched in the face? And is my tap, my verbal tap, going to be acknowledged? And how do we, negotiate that across different clubs and in martial arts settings? And I love this paper because I think it really poignantly points out how we do have such stringent guidelines for what consent needs to be in medicalized consent, and like now we're moving towards enthusiastic consent in terms of sex, but martial arts or these like contact sports where their lack of consent can have really high consequences, is so there's just been much less thought, if any thought, given to it. And I love this piece.
Well, thanks. I'm glad that it's helped to sort of figure out that, and that story, hear stuff like this all the time. And it's not just martial arts, it's sports, especially competitive sports. And unfortunately it's particularly acute in children's competitive sports. So thinking about elite youth level performance, but in sports where the youth are actually the very top performers, so in gymnastics, figure skating, some swimmers, there are case studies that come out time and time again, either academic research or journalistic reporting about abuse, child abuse, basically, whether that's sexual abuse, but physical, psychological, emotional abuse of athletes that's happening because of these kind of power dynamics with coaches. And that's not to say that every time you get a sort of domineering coach, it's always abusive, but it sets the scene where abuse can become normalized, particularly when we're talking about children. I mean, we're talking about you here, an experienced adult practitioner who can say, hold on a minute, this isn't okay. If you didn't have that experience, if you were a child, you've got no agency, you've got no power to push back against this. So I think it's absolutely urgent, to figuring out safeguarding concerns, to figuring out how to implement supportive and positive cultures in sport where, yes, we do push hard, we do train, we aim for excellence, all the rest of it, but we make sure that people retain the ability to make their own decisions about what they do with their bodies, especially in dangerous sports like combat sports, gymnastics. We're talking about potentially life and limb on the line in these sort of situations, and if we don't have a proper way of understanding what consent is in sport, then it opens the door to this kind of stuff. So it really surprised us that there's no research until we published this. There was only one piece of published research that tried to articulate how consent is done in sports. I referenced it, we referenced it a few times in the paper. It's a book about mixed martial arts and BDSM in the US by Jill Weinberg. Really, really good book. But that's the only piece of research that had looked at this before. So it kind of surprised us, really. And I think, hopefully we will see more research, particularly in youth sport settings, about how these kinds of things happen and what kind of guidelines, we can implement to ensure that there's at least an understanding of what consent is in sport contexts.
Yeah, I think this youth context, I really hadn't paid, I think, as much attention as I should have. I think the conversation that comes up a lot in the consent space is the MMA question, where in the last few years, we've seen a number of circumstances where a fighter has been on the stool and really they're saying to their team, I don't want to go back out there. And the team's like, come on, you can do it. And they're pushing them out like the opposite of the thing that you just explained, that is a tradition in boxing where the corner will throw in the towel. We're seeing in MMA, the need to try and win and get the win bonus and earn money is causing sometimes the coaches to override the consent. And I've heard the argument, and I don't disagree, that is it going to take someone to die in the ring for us to actually implement some of the recommendations maybe from your paper, or get some researchers in to say, how can we do this better?
Absolutely. I think that's a fear that's shared by a lot of people that organize and run MMA. Another study that I did that fed into this one, some of the data in this paper came from this study, was I shadowed referees at mixed martial arts events, and I interviewed them. Some particularly very experienced top refs, And yeah, they were saying exactly this. Some of the things that we see in the sport, it's a miracle that someone hasn't died, or that people don't die more regularly, because people have, tragically, usually to do with weight cutting. But yeah, the normalization of this idea that you go out on your shield, you don't tap to strikes, like my friend said. It's just ridiculous. You're losing. You've lost. This guy, this girl, she's better, he's better, whatever. The game's over. And you can say that, and you can own up to that, and you'll live by another day. And so often this is left up to the referee, or it's left up to the coaches, who then don't come good on that expectation. So yeah, I think everyone in this field can benefit from thinking a bit more carefully about consent and about the importance of consent, as well as the context of things like brain injuries and all the rest of it that makes this super important. But yeah, absolutely.
Let's go back to some of the problems with each of those 4 types of consent that you alluded to. So first we had explicit consent. What issues are there?
Okay, so yeah, this is a great one. I mean, often these forms that you're asked to sign at events, and I witnessed quite a few of these sort of low-level regional kind of MMA and boxing, kickboxing shows when I was studying medical provision in these sports, and hardly any of them had any form signing going on. A couple of them did, and it was just something that somebody knocked up on their computer. It wasn't, it wasn't really very detailed. It was just sort of a play for some kind of like insurance liability thing. I think it was sort of ticking a box for the insurer to make sure they had sort of signed consent forms. Do these consent forms provide information about what is likely to happen to you? If you have surgery, you sit down with the surgeon beforehand, and they explain the complications, they explain alternatives, they go through with you, they make sure you understand, then you sign it. In this context, it's not that at all. And presumably people have some kind of understanding about brain injuries, or the possibility of contracting a bloodborne disease, or neurological complications, or if you've got an underlying health condition, heart problems, maybe you have that knowledge, but there's no effort to make sure you do. So that form signing often is very much a perfunctory tick box, get it out the way, get on with it kind of thing, if it happens at all. Equally, the referee's question, are you ready? Are you ready? I mean, that's not a real question, is it? It's performative. It's for the cameras. Nobody is going to say, actually, ref, I'm not ready. I'm having second thoughts. That's not going to happen. It's not a genuine question. I did write in the paper, we saw moments where the referee did actually have, genuine little quiet discussions with fighters. Some of the medics, like you, told me that they would do this. They would just sort of sit and have a little word, tap me on the shoulder if you're worried, and we'll get you out of it, kind of thing. So they do this, but it's not necessarily always happening. So explicit consent, I think we would say this is what we would like to see a lot more of. But there are things like peer pressure. There are questions about how much information people have, how performative these things are. So they don't always, when we see it happening, that doesn't necessarily mean people really have given their informed, freely, no pressure consent. So that's
it makes me think of always before I've gone out to fight in kickboxing, so in Muay Thai, the medic goes around and when they sign off your gloves, they always ask you, have you been concussed or have you been rocked in the last 10 weeks in sparring? Like, as if anyone who's done put in a full fight camp, gone through the weight cut, made weight, rocked up to the fight night, has like having their gloves signed off, is going to be like, yeah. It's such a silly question to ask, because nobody's going to truthfully answer it at that moment.
And I've seen that question asked in front of all of the other fighters. So my opponent is sitting right there. Do you have any weaknesses, Alex?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. But yeah, it's going through the motions. I mean, it's presumably it's better than nothing at all. But it doesn't mean it's gold standard.
Yeah. Okay, next, the rituals, like the fist bumping or things like that. What are the problems with that?
So it becomes perhaps a little bit too routinized. So we step on the mat and we bow and we come in, and we really does it really mean consent to us? You know, when we slap and bump, do we really think that through? Like you said, you know, you're in the ring, you've touched gloves, you've said let's go, and then you get lamped. You know, like, hold on, does it really mean this? So when we aren't explicitly negotiating, and especially, and we can take some big sort of signals from the research on sex consent here. You know, you give consent in a way that perhaps the other person thinks means A, but you actually mean B. And you go, oh, hold on a minute, I actually meant B. Oh, but you know, I thought we were doing A, you know, and without that kind of explicit negotiation and that back and forth communication, these kind of implicit signals can sometimes be misread. So a good example of this, again, to sort of lean into the sex research area, is if, you know, you're kissing somebody and then, you know, they start to like take your clothes off or something. If you do nothing, does that mean that you're happy with them to continue doing this? You know, if you enthusiastically help them or you start with their clothes, I mean, that's probably a good signal, yes. If you do nothing, is that a signal yes, or is it a signal no, or is it, what does it mean? So if we're relying on sort of implicit communication, we can run into problems. So, you know, back to the martial arts context, I think your story summarizes this really, really well. If you hadn't had the guts to say, actually, you know what, hang on, let's not do this, you know, you could have got hurt in that moment, and everyone in that space would have thought you were fine with it, which you clearly weren't, right? So it can break down when we're not being careful with our communication. Equally, you know, new members to the gym, they don't necessarily understand all these things. We might overread someone's body language. It might be that that person caught me really flush with that left hook and they didn't really mean to, but I think, oh, hang on, it's game time. And then I smack them back. And then suddenly they feel like, oh shit, we're in a fight. And now, you know, we've got this kind of escalation of, so we've basically just misread each other, you know, and without intending to, we're actually going much harder than either of us really want to. So there are a few ways when we're not having direct conversations that we can maybe misread those cues and they can get away from us. That doesn't mean that the majority of the time they aren't really, really good ways to communicate consent, because we can't, every time we spar, we can't go through, you know, let's sit down and work it all out for 5 minutes. You know, we want to get on with it. So we have those rituals for a reason, but again, they can have moments where they don't serve us particularly well.
Yeah. It makes me think of flow rolling, right? Like how hard it often is to flow roll. It's like this starts out at, you know, 40%, and then it's just all of a sudden we're fully rolling, you know, like it's very difficult, and we'll probably come back to that around some strategies for that. But
I mean, most of the time you work that out, don't you? It's not too bad, but you can imagine moments where perhaps, you know, if someone's just, especially with new, you know, people who are new to sparring in jiu-jitsu, they get quite scared, you know, because it's unsettling, and they might freak out a little bit, and that's when we're talking about, you know, injury risk. If their opponent is expecting them to roll at 40% and suddenly they're at 100 out of nowhere. But yeah, sorry. So next, the assumed consent. So, you know, this is where we're basically, we're not having any kind of attempt to know that for sure this person in this space at this time definitely is happy with what I think they are. So there's just an assumption. There's no communication. One of the really sort of fitting examples of this that I can remember was, again, from the medic study, backstage with the medic, and she's talking to this young lad who I think probably 14, 15, you know, junior categories, and he's visibly upset. You know, he's not enjoying himself being there. I mean, you get nervous before a competition, but you know, and then she explained to me later, I didn't sit in on this conversation, obviously it was, you know, it's confidentiality and everything, but she explained to me later, you know, that this kid, he clearly didn't want to be there, but he was really scared because he turned up, he was in that space with his team, with his coach, with everybody else. He didn't feel like he could take himself out of that space. So for everybody else to see him once he's walked out into the arena, none of that is visible. Purely the presence in the space at the time, which everybody else recognizes is a sign that you're happy. They don't know what's going on under the surface. And again, we're kind of back to the youth issue here, that just assuming that somebody being present in that space signifies consent is, you know, it's very much a loaded assumption, and it might not tell us the full story. And again, your story, I think, served up a really good illustration of how these things can go wrong. oh, but surely, Georgia, if you came to this camp, you must be ready to get knocked out constantly in sparring, because that's what we do here, right? Didn't you know that, right? So without you being able to explicitly challenge those assumptions, your consent is being assumed where it didn't exist. So that, again, it's pretty clear to see how that could break down. Another way that breaks down is often what happens below the sort of top level of combat sports, and you might have experienced this yourself as a kickboxer, is you'll be booked to fight somebody at a certain weight class in, let's say it's Muay Thai, or it's K1, or it's, there are different classes in Muay Thai, aren't there? It's like A class and B class, is that right?
Or not in Australia, we just have like pro and amateur.
Okay, I might be getting my disciplines all mixed up, but there are different classes, different rule sets, and you turn up on the night and your opponent is 10 kilos heavier and wants to fight in a different rule set. And there's quibbling about what the agreement ever was, because it was all done by text and no one can find the message. And in the moment, it's like, well, hey, she's here and you're here. So either, if you want your 200 quid, then, you've got to go out and fight, someone who's bigger and in a rule set that you didn't prepare for. So you're here, you're a fighter, you're part of this sport. Surely you must be okay with it, because fighters are always ready for anything, aren't they? Anywhere, anytime, any place. So again, there's this kind of possible exploitation of this by people that maybe are a little bit unscrupulous when it comes to organizing these matches. So yeah, again, numerous ways that can crack.
Yes. Oh my gosh, so many. Was that the last one?
So the final one, deferred consent. I mean, it's obvious, right?
Yeah.
You're leaving it up to the coach, but the coach doesn't have a great record, and maybe the coach's rival is coaching the other guy, and the coach doesn't want to throw the towel in, right? For whatever their motivation might be. Maybe the coach doesn't understand, doesn't see that you're in trouble. As you described, you're on the stool in between rounds and you're saying, I'm done. And the coach is like, no, I know her. She's got more in the tank. What she really needs is a little bit of a talking to. Come on, you're going to go out there and you're going to be fine. And then, she gets off the stool and 30 seconds later, she's knocked out. It might be that the referee is unable to see that you've been choked out. I actually saw this happen. One of the fights I went to for the medic study, the referee, so this was a mixed event. It was in a cage, but it was MMA, kickboxing. They had a bare knuckle fight on. They had a jiu-jitsu match. It was a mixed thing. The referees were all kickboxing refs, and they were perfectly competent and qualified kickboxing refs, but they didn't know jiu-jitsu. So there's an MMA fight, and firstly, it's an amateur fight, so they shouldn't be throwing elbows, particularly to a grounded opponent, and that was happening, and the ref was just letting it happen. And then a guy got caught in a triangle, the triangle choke, and didn't tap, and the ref was just standing, just watching, like waiting. And everybody around the cage was on their feet screaming, he's out, ref, he's out. And the fighter who won the fight looked up at the ref and was like, he's out, sort of thing. And so this guy was unconscious for 10, 20 seconds probably, before the referee, okay, I better stop this. So consent had been deferred to a person who was in that case incompetent and not able to make informed decisions about that person's health. So again, it's not to blame necessarily the fighters there. That's the culture of the sport. Maybe the guy thought he could escape and he just didn't, caught up with him and he passed out before he managed to tap. The other fighter was doing what he's supposed to. He's winning the fight. And that culture of the sport, which says, you are not responsible for the other person's well-being because the referee is there, right? That's the infrastructure that's in place. In that case, the sport let him down. So, there are so many ways we could go on about deferred consent having problems, particularly when we get into the realms of abusive coaching relationships, and there's loads that we could unpick with that. But that's how they might break down there. Yeah,
my gosh, it's so helpful, I think, for folks to have that framework in their minds. It really helps me when I think about the classes that I teach. So, I mean, it's a little bit easier in a trauma-informed space. it's very front of everyone's mind that this other person might not be comfortable at any moment. And so there's lots of checking in, but also it's super culturally embedded. So for example, like when we're hitting pads, we'll start that off by saying, okay, you're going to go as light as possible, and then slowly increase the intensity that you're hitting pads, even on pads, right? But you could imagine that could be sparring. So they'll say, the person receiving, they get to choose how hard you're allowed to hit them, and they'll tell you, you can go harder, you can go harder, you can go harder, you can go harder. And they'll do that up until a point, and then after a little while, when we're getting excited, it's very common for someone to stop and go, oh, is that still okay? Is that intensity still okay? Is that feedback still okay? And they check back in, and it literally takes seconds, and it doesn't feel like awkward and weird because we've always done it, so it doesn't have to become this like whole new thing. When I contrast that, one thing I tried to do once I thought about this was I was like, I'm going to get informed consent from all my training partners. So I was like, okay, I'm going to ask everyone, what intensity as a percentage would you like to roll? So do you want to go 100%? Do you want to go 80%? Or do you want to go 50%? And I just found it was really awkward because it wasn't normalized as like a thing that people did. I just stopped doing it. I think I tried it a couple of times and I was like, oh, I feel like I'm the odd one out, so I'm not going to do it. But I see a lot of value in it,
Yeah, so I do that. I always ask about injuries. Are you okay in injuries? Well, I mostly
I do that.
Not every single time, but I make a habit of that. Partly because I've usually got an injury, so I want to tell them. But yeah, that feeds in. And I think in my gym, especially because I'm one of the older guys, I guess, in my gym, there's perhaps an expectation that the older guys might do that because we're carrying more injury baggage, so to speak. And it hasn't gone down like in a way that I feel awkward with having those quick conversations, because it's just a quick couple of seconds, and I'll ask if I want to go a bit lighter. I'll ask, and I'll make a point of that so that my partners know I'm okay for you to ask me, if you want to go lighter. Totally fine. But yes, it's still, like I said before, we don't have time to sit down and really hash out all of the things that we want to go through, but we can find those few seconds. Maybe the timer started. It doesn't matter if you spend the first 10 seconds briefly explaining that you got armbarred last week. So, if you're going to attack my right arm, I'll tap quickly just to let you know, that kind of thing. It takes very little time. And I think it's not just about protecting ourselves in the moment. It's also about fostering a culture of being more explicit with consent, which, I think we've kind of skirted around that a few times in this discussion. That's basically the main ambition of this in terms of practice is, let's try and get this on people's radars. It doesn't mean everything has to be signed in triplicate and all legalized like in medicine, but it does mean we need to be a bit more conscious of how we can be a bit more reflective and owning our consent a bit more more consistently.
Yeah, let's talk about that at the level of the coach and the level of the student. So what can coaches do to embed consent into their culture?
So I think, first of all, coaches, whatever the discipline is, they can be nice and clear about, particularly when it comes to sparring, about the do's and don'ts. You might put posters up in the club. You see sometimes, certainly in the gyms that I've been in, you see things like, leave your ego at the door kind of thing, and, show respect and all that kind of like little motivational little thingies and what have you. You could easily, stick a bit of wall space up for rules. These are the rules, maybe the rules of the sport, competition rules, but also the etiquette for the club. It doesn't mean that everyone has to constantly follow the same etiquette all the time in that really kind of rigid, old school fashion, but it just makes it clear that there is an etiquette here. Keep your nails clipped, right? Wash your gi, the basic hygiene sort of things. If you've got an injury, it's your responsibility to disclose it to the coach. So basic things like this that just put it not only in the moment to help people do those things right, but also put it into people's minds that it's okay to be conscious of this. We're not creating hardcore warriors here. We're doing a sport that's fun, and we're doing it in a positive way. And part of that is everyone, looking out for each other and all that kind of stuff. So coaches can take small steps like that to foster that sort of spirit, as well as having conversations themselves with people that they train, making it clear whenever sparring starts. How many seconds would it take to say, talk to your partners before you start rolling? It's like 10 words or whatever, very, very briefly, like talk to each other, look after each other, don't go too high. It's simple little things like this, just to make sure that everyone knows, unless we're doing, full on competition class prep for a fight, look after each other. And even when we are going hard, still put that in your mind. So I think coaches can play a really important role in setting the tone. Okay, so I think for when it comes to students, practitioners of different martial arts and combat sports, I think the main thing here, the main take home, is to be more assertive about your own boundaries. It's okay to say that this is not what I want to do. To stand up and sort of make sure that your own sort of personal dignity is respected in these spaces. In all sports, it's very important that people are aware that just because the coach says you have to do something, you don't actually have to do that thing. The coach is saying because they believe this is a good way for you to develop, perhaps, or it's part of their their training regime or whatever, but it doesn't mean that you have to do it. And being more explicit with where your own boundaries lie, as well as being open to and having those conversations with other people about where their boundaries lie. I think that's crucial. That's what a good culture of consent looks like, where people are conscious of this and are taking steps to protect and to promote each other's welfare in that sort of positive way. And consent's a really big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it can be like a gradual type of thing as well. Like, if we talk about the story that I was saying before, I didn't storm out of the cage. I stayed in the cage. And in hindsight, actually, if it was to have happened to me now, I would have left. I would have been even clearer when my attempt at expressing how I was not consenting to that was pulled away. But 5 years before that, I wouldn't have said anything. Like, I just would have accepted it. And it's been like as you get practiced at doing that, it becomes like a little bit easier and you realize that you do have a say. But it's hard just to go from you've never stood up for yourself and you've never set a boundary to like doing that regularly. So sometimes it can be just like the small things, maybe like you didn't say it at the time, but you get up the courage to write an email and say like, hey, in class last week, I actually felt a little bit uncomfortable in this situation. And I just wanted you to be aware of that and see how we can rectify that in the future if that feels like gentler and an easier thing to do.
Absolutely, yeah. This is all about giving people an opportunity to be empowered and to take control of their own activity, their own exercise. We're talking about people doing things with their bodies that are potentially quite dangerous. So, why wouldn't you want people to have that, to retain that autonomy? It's so important in an ethical sense, but also in a legal sense. You're protecting yourself as a coach if you're open to this kind of thing. And this might be a difficult thing for some martial arts instructors to swallow, especially if they're really old school and they're used to that kind of really hierarchical, authoritarian kind of approach. But that's not the world we live in. And with increasing awareness around brain trauma, especially, I know we've mentioned this a few times now, but this is the context that we're dealing with. We're doing something that, when it's striking sports, we are risking traumatic brain injuries. So people have to be able to consent to this. It's non-negotiable. So it would be nice to see a bit more conscious sort of movement in this kind of direction, I think.
Yeah, it wouldn't be nice. One final question then. What do you predict? I know you're not a fortune teller, but what do you predict to be the future of consent in combat sports?
So from a research point of view, where we need to go next with this is we need to understand how long-term exposure to particularly head injuries affects a person's ability to consent. There is some research on this. It's not good. The messaging is, you're more likely to lose the cognitive capacity to understand the risks and to be more, sort of gung-ho with these sort of things. We need to understand more about how children are giving, or how consent is given on behalf of children and young adults, and what kind of not just what's done at the institutional level in sports, because everyone's got a safeguarding policy now. Everyone puts the welfare of the child at the heart of everything that we do. We've heard that many times from sports governing bodies, but we need to understand how is that implemented on the ground. How do coaches and other practitioners working with young people actually enable kids to make their own decisions and to have ownership. So we need to do some work on that. And equally, I think it's quite important as well that we don't lose sight of some of the more pressing issues with consent as they relate to sport. So, for instance, sexual harassment and consent in that kind of context, which is unfortunately a bit of an issue in combat sports at the moment. And also medical consent, athletes' rights to receive medical care that is actually in their best interests and not just in the service of promoting sports performance, which is a completely different topic, the sports medicine stuff. But there's some really, really critical findings in that kind of area that suggest that sometimes sport medicine is not in the service of athletes' interests, and they're not, they're consenting to treatments that are not necessarily actually going to help them. So, there's a few things for us to do academically. What the future looks like in practice, it's difficult to tell, but I do think we're moving towards, particularly again with the brain injury stuff, we're moving towards more litigation. We're moving towards athletes being more organized and more aware, and raising that awareness, and ultimately, hopefully, having more informed decision-making process around full contact sparring, full contact competition. So I think we seem to be moving in the right kind of direction with this, that we're not just throwing people in the deep end, we're thinking about what we're doing to our brains, and that can only be a good thing. So hopefully that continues.
Yeah, I really hope so. Speaking as someone who's done striking for a while, it is really hard to use the brain that may possibly be impacted by damage to decide whether or not you've been affected. That is like even a head spin just to try and think about, let alone, put into practice for a coach who's got a lot of people. Like, it's such an important topic.
Yeah. There's some other researchers I could put you in touch with who you might want to talk to about this, who we can talk about after.
Yes, definitely. Let's talk about that. I mean, we could have just cut that at the end, last bit there. So please tell me that. Also, what are they? I forgot the name. The group that are doing the sport development program that started in Brazil that are now in London.
Fight for Peace.
Fight for Peace. Yeah.
Yes.
If you can put me in touch with them,
fantastic.
I would love to have them on the potty.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I owe them a couple of emails. I'm a little bit behind with my contact with them, so I'll get onto that, and I'll ask if they're interested. The Conscious Combat Club, right? Is that the name of the podcast as well as the general project? Yes. Yeah, lovely. And no, I think they'd be great. I mean, they are they're the people that do the work, not the researchers that critique it. But they'll have some great stories for you. And they are, I say, one of the better examples of a sport development program that we've seen at our university. They really do take it seriously. They're not just sort of jumpers for goalposts and everything will be fine kind of outfit. So yeah, that's cool.
Which is awesome. It's good to have that balance. I want to be super respectful of your time, so thank you so much for this. We'll make another time some point in the future.
Thank you for being part of the club. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, please refer to the information in the show notes. If you'd like to support this podcast, please consider leaving us a review or subscribing on whichever platforms you use to listen or watch the podcast. The Conscious Combat Club acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands in which we work, live and play. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We'd like to say thank you to Nari for the beautiful song Shape Me, heard at the beginning and end of every episode. If you'd like to connect with Nari, you can find her on Instagram at Nari the Saga.
You need to know that nobody shapes me but me. Don't gotta tell you what my name is, I don't gotta explain it. Walk in the room, hear a boom erupting like I'm famous. I'm here shedding shells, I'm shameless. I fear nothing, no complacence. walk too many tight ropes with no hope, so I became this poster they hold over all the heads of trauma holders. You don't need to know my history, I move boulders. Atlas shrug, cause I lifted the weight up off his shoulders. No pretense of defense, move first like chess soldiers. This goes deeper than empowerment, cause I'm the one that power it. Physical meets mental, challenge me to keep devouring. If I can't change the scenery, at least I change perspectives. No longer isolated, but elevated and selective. Darkest places become beautiful spaces. This is where rage meets patience, meets power meets gracious. Meets, we're so glad you came and the feeling is contagious. When you the walking impact of intended bad intentions. When you the manifesting of collecting all they tensions. You the soul and body hold it all and still remember. But I'm a work in progress, testament to all contenders. Forgot what it was like to have control over self. Forgot what it was like to be the one in charge. Forgot in my reflection I could see all my wealth. Forgot that with my bare hands I break all these bars, barriers and obstacles. They can't cage me, they can't chronicle all my experiences and reduce them to appearances. When I was truly beaten, gave myself clearances to fall down, mess up, and get myself back up. I'm not looking for clovers cause I don't believe in luck. Damn, you were badass, I heard them say it clearly. Why thank you very much, I know now I'm not weary of what's next for me. Cause I expect to see growth like I was planted, watered, fed, and bloomed to be. The positivity and accountability, knowing they won't step if I'm the agent of my agency. I think I found my voice again, huh? I think I found my voice again, huh? I'm not sorry, you're the end where I begin. Boundaries, I know them well. Take a breath and meditate. Who is she? I know her well. Now I get to open gates. 1, 2, 1, 2. I don't need your permission. And if you get uncomfortable, then use your intuition to know that I won't stay where respect is ever missing. And everything I do, that's me making decisions. It's truly underrated, the value of self-worth. Forgot that I was rich from the moment of my birth. A penny for my thoughts, no really, you can't afford it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it, huh?